Hello everybody. I want to send you greetings from Italy. I would have loved to be there personally, but my body isn't allowing me to travel as much as I will be able to, I think, in the future. And so I'm going to hope at least that you will be satisfied with a video. I was thinking with the subject of Ananda's 30th anniversary of sort of reminiscing a little bit about starting community, because after all, I'm the guy who did it. I'm the culprit, you might say. I first got this idea, I don't know when, probably before I was born, because there was always in my mind a wish to create a better way of life, to offer people a better way of interacting and so on. But it became more conscious in my mind in about when I was about 14, or even more specifically when I was 15 years old. That was in 1941, and the war had started. America hadn't yet come in. That was December of 1941 that the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor, and so I wasn't yet aware of our intimate involvement, but I was certainly sort of pushed in the direction of thinking about world peace and the future of mankind and so on. And having grown up in Europe and having seen the German people as wonderful people, I couldn't think of them in the black and white terms that are that were normal in those days, where propaganda tried to make everybody hate the Germans. I couldn't do that. I knew that the things that Hitler was doing were not good, and in fact were bad. But more than that, I knew them as human beings. I'd grown up with them in Romania, and I was looking for a peace that would not come with victory over enemies. I was looking for a peace that would perhaps create a new alternative for mankind. But in the beginning, there was also a thought of withdrawing from a human scene that was essentially imperfect. And in that imperfection, it seemed to me that mankind needed to get back to some pristine element that would be not everybody would be able to do it, but those who were ready to live in harmony with each other perhaps could drop out of society and create a viable and harmonious alternative, and that this would perhaps serve as a model for other people. And I even sort of, because my thinking then, I think it was normal at that time, was somewhat apocalyptic, that maybe after everything had sort of gone up in smoke, this small group of people could come back with an ideal way of life, that they would be able to rebuild the world and create a civilization that would be harmonious, advanced, not primitive, but at the same time filled with love and peace and forgiveness and all those qualities. This was my dream then, sort of an adolescent dream really, and yet still it had the elements. I was very interested in starting a community, and I got all my friends interested in doing it with me, but they were interested only until they found out that I was serious, at which point they all dropped out and I was left alone. And I thought, well, I've got to rethink this more. And it occurred to me then, gradually, as I grew older and studied other communities, read books, I read H.G. Wells and The Shape of Things to Come and so on, and it occurred to me that with the world becoming so small in a sense, that you can, with a very little effort, you can go around the world even. You couldn't do it quite as easily then as now, but still the world was shrinking even then. And it seemed to me that as a sort of counterpoise to bigness, what we needed also was smallness. That people were becoming too impersonal. And if we could have small villages where people related to each other, knew each other, could help each other, it would be wonderful. The snag that I hit in my thinking then was the fact that villages are notorious for gossip and meanness and the insular kind of mentality that we've all heard about and seen, which this increase in communication and speed of travel and so on is reducing to some extent. There's not the same pettiness that you find, or that you used to find, in villages. And I didn't want a village that was a bunch of hicks, people who knew nothing of progress, and all they did was stick straw in their ears and their hair, I mean, or something like that. And I was thinking that we do need smallness, but we need to work it out so that it's not a petty kind of smallness, that it has an ideal. At that time, I didn't yet have the concept, and it hadn't yet been proposed in anything that I'd read, about intentional communities. I was only thinking community. I didn't know more than that. But gradually, my mind began turning toward other ways of helping mankind to achieve the perfection that I was dreaming about. And I thought of it in political terms, in artistic terms, in scientific terms, I studied all these angles. It may seem strange for a teenager to be thinking this way, but I can't offer an excuse. That's the way I was thinking. I was thinking of it all the time. How can this world be improved? How can mankind be improved? How can the way we look at life be improved? How can we find truth? But to me, truth began, first of all, at the age of 13 even. I was thinking of becoming an astronomer, thinking that may be truth. But I realized that's just facts, that's not truth. What is truth? And it came to my mind then that truth has to be something that inspires us. It can't be just statistics. It can't be knowing how many galaxies or stars or whatever there are. It can't be knowing how matter is composed. It's got to be something that touches human life. And this gradually turned me more toward art. You might think, well, why, if I had all this interest, didn't I think about God? Well, the truth is I thought about him all the time. But I didn't understand God as something that you could know. I imagined that being, whatever it was, that could produce all these stars, couldn't be aware of you and me and our toothaches and our little sufferings and so on. It seemed like it would be inevitably impersonal and vast. I couldn't understand infinity as including the concept of infinitesimal. And moreover, more than that, I'd been to church schools, I'd been to church. I was brought up in the Church of England, which is the Episcopal Church. And my relatives, my family, are still good Episcopalians. I was never a good Episcopalian, I'm sorry to admit. It just never really did anything for me. I didn't feel any inspiration. It was much too sort of, there was no joy in it. There was no love in it. It was all talking about what's proper and right and what the Bible says. And then our minister in the Church of St. James the Less in Hollywood this was during the war, and he kept saying, if you don't do so and so and so and so, you'll end up right in the lap of the Nazis. And so it just seemed so far from religion as I would have liked it to be. There was no inspiration to me. And I went through the whole thing. I went through confirmation, and I went to church with my mother. But I remember one day saying to my mother, I'm not going to go to church with you anymore. And she wept bitterly. She was convinced that I would go to hell, that I was a lost soul. And I remember the joy with which she came to me one day, and she said that she'd just read a book in which the author said that many times a person's real religious conversion began with rejection of the church and rejection of God. And she said, I realize there is hope for you. And I said, you've understood. I knew that I was much more serious than I would have been if I'd kept on going. I was looking for something that I could take very seriously and not just a social convention. Nevertheless, I didn't really turn toward God until not very long before I met Master, and that's all in the path also. I remember going out one night, this was in Charleston, South Carolina, it was an evening, and I was walking out and it became gradually dark. But I was thinking, what is God? I thought, well, this is the first time I had really faced the issue of trying to figure out what God is. Now, it may seem ridiculous to try to figure it out, but one has to start somewhere. And I thought, well, he can't be sort of like a policeman on a cloud, checking us out and directing the traffic down here and throwing us into hell if we have the wrong thought or anything. He's got to be consciousness, not just conscious. How can I be conscious if it isn't part of something much more than just my brain? And if I'm a part of that consciousness has to be God. But it can't be the consciousness that I have with its limited thinking of I want this and I did that. It's got to be something much purer, much more infinite. And I have to be a part of it. All of us have to be a part of that consciousness, that it's from that we can begin to even think. Without that consciousness, we wouldn't exist. At least we wouldn't ever be conscious. And if that's true, then all the differences that you find among people depend upon how close we are to that consciousness or how far we are from it. And that the goal of life then has to be, my logic was pushing me in this direction, it has to be to tune ourselves to that consciousness, to somehow get rid of the limitations, get rid of the impurities, the imperfections, the selfishness, and the whatever. It has to be something that we have to remove, a barrier, in order to become aware of this infinite perfection. And the more aware we are, and the more in tune with that perfection we are, the more we will fulfill what is our own basic nature and what is our own actual destiny. Well, these thoughts, coming at them really from scratch, you might say, because I hadn't read these things. I'd made it a point not to read about religion. However, I had read people like Emerson and Thoreau who had some of that consciousness. So it's not as if I came out of total ignorance, but it hadn't put it together for me until that night. And I remember coming back to the apartment that I shared with four other young men, and they were all in the kitchen sort of laughing and telling jokes, and I was very serious. My brain was reeling under the impact, under the weight, you might say, of these great thoughts. And they were looking at me sort of mockingly, as young men will do, and so, oh, what's the matter with Don, ha ha ha, kind of thing. But their very laughter was such a put-off for me that I had to stay alone. I went to my room and I just thought, well, I couldn't do any more thinking, but I just was sort of dazed, you might say, by the grandeur of the concept that had come to me. And I had, it's not as if this was totally the first time I thought of it. I remember when I was at Brown University about a year earlier, and I had gone on a beach party, and I remember taking a long walk down the beach, and I was thinking that this same sky and this same ocean that is lapping on this beach where everybody's having a good time and laughing and eating hot dogs or whatever they were eating then, this same atmosphere, this same sea, this same planet is touching other beaches. And somehow with that, we're all united. And what touches us touches them. And there's a certain oneness that we all share. I didn't know more than that. But this later evening in Charleston, I sort of put it more together. And I thought, now there's no way I can avoid God. And I left Charleston. My father had been sent to Egypt. He worked for Esso, which now is Exxon, but in Europe it's still known as Esso. And he was the geologist there looking for oil in that country. And Mother was in Scarsdale. Actually, we'd rented the house, so we had a house in White Plains, which is nearby. And I tried reading the Bible, which I found there in her house, and it was so different from what I was looking for. It began with a whole series of supposedly historical events that just didn't make any sense to me. And then when I got to that part where so-and-so lived to be several hundred years old, and he begat so-and-so, and he died, and as I've often put it, I bogged down in the begats. I just really thought, well, it may be grand and great, but it just doesn't say anything to me. So then I happened to see on her bookshelf a book called The Short World Bible. I think it was put out by Viking Press. And I thought, well, this may be a way of seeing what other religions have said. And in fact, when I came, first of all, I read excerpts from the sayings of Jesus in the Old Testament. They were beautiful. But again, I couldn't relate them to this cosmic understanding that I was looking for confirmation. And again, in my training, in my intellectual reading, I was much too intellectual then, but I arrived at all these things just through the intellect. And it didn't reach that thought that my scientific reading had given me the feeling of need for, which was experience. It wasn't enough to say that I believe. You can believe all kinds of things. People believed that the world is flat. That didn't make it flat. And science believed all sorts of things too, and then discovered they were wrong. So I wasn't satisfied with the poetry of Lao Tzu and the beautiful maxims of Confucius and the sort of apocalyptic proclamations of Islam, and the sayings of Jesus were couched in parables that I couldn't get my hands on. But when I read the sayings of the scriptures of India, then I suddenly found two things. One was the cosmic nature of the universe and of God, and the other was that we have to experience this for ourselves. It's not enough just to believe it. And the third was, in fact, a confirmation of what I'd come to believe had to be the truth, which was that we can and must somehow bridge the gap between human and divine consciousness. We have to attune ourselves to that divine consciousness. And with that, I was very touched to read that where it said, I think it was in the Bhagavad Gita, that who would know me must go into a solitary place and meditate on me. And all my life I'd been very attracted to the life of solitude, and the thought of being a hermit was very appealing to me. And so when it said that you must go to a solitary place and meditate on me, I thought, well, that's what I want to do with my life. I want to find peace. I didn't dream more than peace. I thought that maybe finding God would be having peace of mind, and to me that was a lot already. And so I decided I had to go and earn money, and maybe I could live in a solitary place more cheaply in South America was my idea. But then I began to think, maybe I'm going crazy, and I need to get my feet down on the ground again. And it was interesting. I had an aunt who was visiting at that time, and she said to Mother, and Mother didn't mention this to me until many years later, but she said, you know, I suspect Don will end up in a seminary. And Mother said, "Oh, not Don," as if anyone else but not he. She was convinced that I was just totally irreligious because this was some secret that I just never would talk about with anyone. And I was very close to her, but I would never talk with her. This aunt of mine, however, was enough out of the scene to see that what other alternative would I have? Anyway, you've probably read my book, The Path. You know about that trip up north into northern New York State and all the efforts I made to get my feet on the ground and live with genuine country folk. And of course it was a disaster. And then you know the story too, how I came back and I had to put my mother on the ship to go to Cairo to join my father. And that was the same day after I put her on the ship, and I went uptown New York, and there I came upon Autobiography of a Yogi. And to make a long story short, I won't tell all that, you know it all, but I came to Master. And for the first time in my life, I knew that was what I was looking for. I had absolute faith in him. I'd never had faith in anyone before, but the first words I had uttered to him were, I addressed to him, I should say, where I want to be your disciple. And I lived with him for some years. One of the things that excited me was the fact that he was very interested in starting communities, and my desire was reawakened at that time, because at first I hadn't known, I'd sort of lost interest in that because I realized God was the important thing. I hadn't known that you could put the two together, and when I found that he himself wanted to, then I became quite interested again. But it was a very secondary interest to my being there, my being his disciple, my practicing yoga, my trying to find God for myself. And yet I was always looking for how to help others, and Master saw that and fanned that flame. I remember once I got into a mood and then I got out of it, and his words to me were, "No more moods now, how will you be able to help others?" And he was always guiding me in the direction of not just finding God for myself, but helping others to find him. And I remember that talk that he gave, and you know that photograph of him where his hands are up, sending out the vibration of Om. And he said, I send these thoughts, I sow my thoughts in the ether. And this thought of communities is what he was talking about. World brotherhood colonies. This thought, these vibrations shall not die. And he was pleading with us to take this idea seriously. Well, I was the only disciple who took that thought seriously. I don't mean that they laughed it off. I don't mean they didn't take it seriously as you take anything that your guru tells you seriously. But I vowed that day that I would do everything I could in this incarnation to fulfill that dream. And so it was that when in the 1960s it began to seem possible, I had a lot of weight behind my endeavor to start something like this. It was from, well, you might say in a way from birth, but certainly it was dynamic to my consciousness from the age of 15. And all the time in my mind I had this thought. I visited a kibbutz in Israel, I visited a community in India, I studied these things even while I was in SRF to see what would make communities work and what would not. There was a financier from Australia who became a friend of mine and a member of SRF, and I was talking with him to see how these communities could be economically viable and so on. So in the beginning, it was really a strong and very deep-seated ideal in my mind. Well, I was living in San Francisco at the time, and there was always this dichotomy that I had, because I wanted to be a hermit. On the other hand, I wanted to help people. On the other hand, I wanted to help everybody. And that, of course, is unrealistic, but still we have unrealistic dreams also, and I don't say that there's any reason why we shouldn't cherish them, because they are a means of our reaching out higher into toward perfection. And so I had this thought on the one hand of going into seclusion, being a hermit. On the other hand, always I expected that crowds would come and enjoy this seclusion with me, and you can call it laughable, but there was in my mind no real split. I just couldn't imagine really being alone, and being alone without people who wanted to be alone with me at least. So I was giving classes in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, and saving the money that I got with the thought of buying land. Well, I'm not going to go into all that story because I'd be keeping you longer than this tape would allow me to, but I did buy the first land and begin to build on it. And you remember from different readings or different stories that others will tell you how I tried to build a geodesic dome, and it fell down on me 3 times in a row. And finally I realized I had to get a qualified carpenter to do this work for me. It just was not my métier, you might say. And I was talking to people about community. I had students, and they were what made it possible for me to build. My father also had given me some stocks, and with that I had about $16,000, which was worth a lot more then than it's worth now, but it's by no means a fortune. And I had to do all this myself because nobody believed in the idea. I remember a meeting that we had in San Francisco, and Jyotish was there, and people were talking about how this idea could not possibly work. And I remember this one man was saying, and he knew somebody who had started some sort of a work there, and he just became a monster, was the way he put it. And I thought, well, they don't know what I'm trying to do, and therefore I need to write it out in a book. And that's when I wrote Cooperative Communities, How to Start Them and Why. I came up to the retreat. I didn't have a dome at that time yet. It was about March or April of 1968, and I wrote it all in a week, walking. I had notes that I'd written over the years, and I was walking and thinking about it and trying to put it all together. And that's when I published that book. It was the 4th book I'd published, because before that was Yours the Universe and Yoga Postures and the Book of Brigu. And this book began to attract a few people. And with those few people, I got this carpenter, and he was a foreman, and these people helped me, and Jyotish had been helping me already. He was sort of my right-hand man in all the work that I have done in this direction. And so then I thought the 16,000 would work, and the carpenter had told me it would take about 2 weeks to do this. Well, in fact, it took 2.5 months. Wages were $1,000 a week, and it seems like a lot, but I paid a lot of high school students to come up and work for $1 an hour, and we got quite a lot done, but we still, after 2 weeks, had only done the foundations. In fact, hadn't quite finished those. So it wasn't long before I ran out of money. And the carpenter just walked off the job. For him, it was just a job. He wasn't going to stand behind this dreamer who had no money and hoped to put up a complex of buildings. Fortunately, there were a couple of other men. One was an older retired carpenter who was willing to back it with me, and another one who was also willing, and with other amateur labor we kept on going. But I had to go back and earn money, so I was living in the city and coming up on weekends, and I was busy giving classes a different city every night, and because I needed more money, Divine Mother sent me more students. It came to about 300 students a week. So that was good income for me, the income I needed, but still I was paying off the debts that we'd incurred gradually, and there was one lumber company nearby that decided that it would go for broke, so to speak of, broke being my being broke. And so it placed a lien on the property. Well, you know, all my adult life I'd been in a monastery, except when I was living in San Francisco, and there I was pretty much out of the worldly scene too. And I had to look up the word lien in a dictionary. But when I found out what it was, I thought, well, it's still nothing to worry about. You know that 2 weeks later I got a letter from the lawyer saying that if I didn't pay it off within 2 weeks, he would foreclose on me. Well, I called the lumber company and I said to Mr. Pardini, who was the head there, I said, well, I've been honoring my commitment. We have an oral agreement and I've been paying you the $500 a month that I promised and that you agreed to. He said, well, Don, you know, you got to be practical in this world. Means greedy, of course. And so I went to his lawyer. And the lawyer said, I don't know anything about an agreement. Show me it in writing. Well, of course, it wasn't in writing. It was a gentleman's agreement. And so I didn't know what to do. And I asked my dad if he would lend me $8,000. And first I asked him if he'd lend me any money. And he said, how much? And I said, 8,000. He said, 8,000? That's a lot of money. That's the last I heard of him. He never gave a dime to Ananda. He did give money to his sons, and in that way I got those stocks, for example, that helped get the building started. But the Seva at that time was taking my classes, and she heard about my predicament. I mentioned it to her and a friend of hers, and so she loaned me $2,000, and that was a great help. She was one of the stalwarts in helping to get Ananda started, not just in the money that she gave, but also while I was giving classes, she came to my apartment and typed out the cooperative communities so that it could be printed in a more professional-looking way. There was an IBM model typewriter, A model, I think it was called then, where you could adjust or justify the right-hand margin, but it took counting every letter in a line, so it took quite a lot of work. So she did that, and she did a lot of other things to help get things going for us. And so she and Jyotish were really you might say, the backbone of what I was trying to do. I still didn't have donors, but there was one man in Texas who sent $1,000, but basically I had to earn everything by my own classes and my own work that way. And when this threat came from the lawyer, I just didn't know what I was going to do. I was giving I gave a slideshow of India in a home in Palo Alto, and afterwards a man came to me outside when I was about to get into the car, and he said, well, I like what you've got and what you're representing. Would you accept donations? And I said, well, yes. So I expected him to give $5 or $10, you know. He wrote out a check for $3,000. That was Tom Hopkins, who lived at Ananda for some time, and recently sent another $3,000 just when we needed it for the court case. And so I'm deeply grateful to him. He seems to have been a karmic tie to help out in times of need. I phoned the lumber company and I said, well, I have the money now, but I was learning by now. I said, I'm not going to pay you. You can incur all the legal expenses possible, and at the last moment I will come in, because 2 weeks wouldn't have done it. They'd have had to start the process, and it would have taken about 2.5 months, I think, altogether. So I said, I'll come in at the last moment and pay it off. And he said, oh, well, gee, if you can pay it now, I'll give you a big discount. So he dug a pit for me and fell into it himself. But with that, gradually I was able to pay off those debts and get the retreat started. And there were a few people who stayed there over the winter to, you know, I couldn't not finish the job if I had the winter storms that have come in and destroyed whatever we'd already done. So I had to finish it that year. But the next year I was still working to build the money to pay off the debts and so on. And in 1969, in the spring, I moved up there, and there was sort of a grapevine in those days. Virtually none of the people who took my classes in San Francisco came to Ananda. There was Lakshmi came, Shivani came, Jaya came, a few others, but very few. Those 300 the students that I had every week, most of them were not taking classes for community. They were learning about yoga. And so we few went up there, but families began to hear about it. Other people began to hear about it. It was sort of the scene that people were doing. I didn't know about the scene, and I had nothing to do with it. But it did, fortuitously, happen to be a time when a lot of people were going out and trying to start what they thought would be idyllic communities. And so the word got out that Ananda was starting too. And so we ended up having to buy the land at the farm also. Well, the difficulty that I faced in the beginning was that most of the people who came didn't know me, didn't even know Master. They were interested in a community, and for that reason they moved up. But there was no thought in the minds of many of fulfilling Master's vision, of fulfilling my dream of communities that I'd worked on for so many years. Each one had his own idea of what he thought a community ought to be, and there was a lot of pressure on me to try to take it this way or that way, going in different directions. And I wanted to do it in such a way that everybody got behind it. Well, that takes patience. I had to win people to the idea. I didn't want to impose it on them. And there was a lot of friction at the time, and uncertainty even as to which path people wanted. Some people wanted to follow the Hare Krishnas and the Krishnas. I remember this one person was cooking with onions, and somebody came in the kitchen and said, "Krishna doesn't like onions." And this other person said, "Well, Yogananda does." But there was all this kind of disharmony that we had to work with, and it would have ruined everything if I had said, "This is how it shall be." So I had to let people gradually learn by their experience, and thank God for Jyotish at that time. Seva was still working in the city and helping out in that way and coming up on weekends, but she hadn't yet moved. And so I had to let people just sort of meet and talk about what they thought Ananda ought to be. Well, really I couldn't work on that level. I was busy. I was more in seclusion, writing books and so on. I've always worked through people rather than directly, and I felt that it wouldn't be helpful even for me to be there. I thought better if they just talk it out among themselves. And in fact, I knew enough from my experience of life that negative energy doesn't cohere anyway. So they spent a lot of time talking back and forth. There was one dog that came there. His name was Blue, and he used to chase or run barking at anybody who came on the grounds. And of course, in a place that's public, that's a lot of people. There was one point there where we had 7 cars in our driveway full of people wanting to join this new community, or commune as some of them thought of it. And their idea of living for God was to go down and swim in the river. The thought of working to support the place didn't occur to them. We had a mortgage to pay that was pretty substantial at that time. $1,700 a month was worth a lot of money then. And to give you just an idea of how money has changed in value, when I built my house at the retreat, the dome, which is the main dome not at the retreat, at Ayodhya, at what is now Crystal Hermitage, that one, to furnish it, to build it, cost me $5,000. It would be a lot more money now. Anyway, people were not interested in our path, but they did want to start a community, and I had to somehow work to bring this together. Well, thank God for Jyotish, because he has a lot more patience than I have in working hands-on relationship with people. I could be patient, but it had to be more from a distance. I couldn't just sit there and listen to them talk and talk and talk. And he could. He has that gift. So thank God for him. He was a very important, essential ingredient in this. There was a time when the people who lived at the farm decided that they didn't want me, even though I never imposed my will. The thought that I could impose my will was already enough of a threat to them. And so they created a legal setup, and they wanted to legally separate the farm community where the married people were living and with families, and the retreat where mostly single people were living. And one of the conditions that they had in this was that Kriyananda would not have any say in anything that they wanted. And I was in India at the time, so there wasn't anything that I could, that I even knew about it. But when I came back and I saw this, I realized that it just was going to fail. There was no way. I called the sort of ringleaders of this thing together, and I said, you know, all the money that's paying that mortgage is coming from people who live at the retreat. You're not earning that money down here. It would you would have 6 months, 3 months for the trustees to decide to foreclose, 3 months for them finally to foreclose, and then you'd be out of here. I said, I'm not going to let you do that. And so they got very upset with my dictatorial ways, which we've heard a lot about in recent times, but this dictatorship amounted to simply deciding that we're not going to allow the thing to fail. They wanted not the right to, I should say, they didn't want to, they didn't want the freedom to put their ideas into effect in the sense of having ideas. All they wanted was to get me out of the picture so they could have ideas. But I had always encouraged people to have ideas. Jyotish had worked at starting the incense and oils business, and I was living down in San Francisco during the winter of 69 to 70, and giving classes again in different parts. I always had the principle that we've got to be dharmic, so that when, for example, one place where I was giving classes, I gave them for 6 weeks, didn't pay me, I wasn't going to sue them. I just said, well, okay. And if people came and said they couldn't afford to take my classes, I said, okay, you can perhaps bring food that we can sell between the 2 classes, and that can raise a little bit of money. You can help set up chairs. But I never turned anyone down just because he couldn't afford. I let them take the classes without paying. It did turn out, in fact, every one of those cases could have paid. But I know one woman said that, well, I'm flying back east to see my parents. And I said, well, you do have some money. She said, yes, I have enough money for the things that matter to me. Well, this kind of insult I just had to swallow. But I thought, I'm not doing it for their sake even. I'm doing it for my own conscience. And when these people were insisting on the freedom to do things the way they felt they should be, I gave them that freedom. It's that I didn't give them the freedom to do things that I'd have to pay for. I know that one of these men wanted to start a motel, and I said, listen, if you want to start a motel down the road, I'm not going to stop you. But if you're going to come up with this idea and ask me and us to fund it, then I have to say, no, we will not. I don't think it's a good idea. But if you think it's a good idea, go ahead. But you earn that money yourself, just as I've earned the money to start this. This to him was dictatorship. And through the years, he has been avidly, vociferously talking about this dictator, Kriyananda. When I was down there living in Sacramento and coming up, I remember calling together a group of people and saying, well, let's realize now that we've got to earn the money to pay for this thing. Well, their idea was that God would take care of it. It was materialism to think of money. In fact, they saw my willingness to give classes to pay off the mortgage as the justification for their divine faith. And to them, living for God meant going down, as I said, and swimming in the river. So they were very upset with me and angry with me because I had suggested that they do something so demeaning as earn the money to pay the mortgage. I had to say to them that I will only do this until June 1st of 1970. And after that I will move up here, and if the mortgage isn't paid, then that's I just won't do any more. You have to do it. We have to do it together. I remember it was in March of 1970 I got a letter from the trustees saying that you have to pay back payments of $4,500 that we still owed, that we hadn't paid because I had said we won't pay that until you've done your part of the deal, which is to put in roads. And they wrote finally and said that that is not legally binding and we aren't going to do it. And if you don't pay this in 2 weeks, again they gave 2 weeks, we'll foreclose on you. Well, I was pretty desperate at that point. I didn't know what I'd do. I was paying the $1,700 a month, but to come up with an additional $4,500 was, I didn't know what to do. I remember Graham Ledgerwood and Suzanne saying, come to we had a little center in Sacramento, come to the ashram and we'll give you tea and you'll feel better. I said, what are you talking about? I'm not interested in feeling better. I'm thinking, what can I do? And I got on the phone. It was after class. It was late at night, and even so, I got people out of bed. I was trying to find people who would promise a certain amount so that we could weather this. And then, fortunately, a couple came and they paid their membership due, the money that everybody had to pay to become a member. And for couples, it was $1,500 at that time. And since then, they've talked against me, and they left Ananda, and they took up drugs, and they couldn't stay. But I've always been grateful to them. It doesn't matter what they say against me. I'm grateful to God who used them, because it was through them, plus the work that I was doing in teaching and making tape recordings we could sell and so on. Through them, I was able, on May 30th, to send the check to the trustees. It was either May 30th or May 31st. They got it just the day that was the ultimatum for them. And I moved up on May 31st to Ananda and stopped having to give classes every night in a different city. July 4th, that was just 1 month later, the temple burned down. We had a few little problems, and I remember this friend of ours, Eleanor Boratinsky, an older woman that Jyotish talked about in a recent talk at Ananda on my birthday. She and I were talking about people's troubles and so on. I said, you know, it's strange, but I haven't had any troubles in my life. She said, no troubles, my God. And she started listing all these threats of foreclosure and temple burning down and so on in the 1 year that she'd known me. And I said, oh yeah, that's true. I'd forgotten about that. My thought has always been, why talk about the hardships? Why not look for the opportunities? Why not think what you can do? Why sit there and brood about what has happened that you can't do anything about? The very day of the fire, I remember going into a local store and I was singing. And the owner of the store, she said, you're singing? I said, well, yes, I lost a temple. I haven't lost my voice. And she said, oh my God, when my house burned down, 6 months I was weeping. And I said, well, why waste 6 months? You stopped weeping after 6 months. So I just thought, well, we'll just do what we have to do. But I knew in my heart God wanted us to do this. And so when the different trials came and the community got all up in arms because, well, for one thing, this little group, the big group, I should say, that met every week to discuss things, they did finally come up with one decision, apart from the decision which took them 5 years to reach to get rid of that dog Blue and move him out of the community. They did also come up with some sort of zoning, and they decided that any industrial area would be put up where Pubble is right now. And I had a secretary at that time. Her name was Diane Parker. I later gave her the name Karuna. And she came into some money and said that she wanted to give me $20,000. Well, I had been thinking that we needed some sort of central office that would not only be a place where everybody would work together and help to centralize the work, but also it would be beautiful, so that when people first came into the farm, which they did from another direction than they come in now, the first thing they'd see would be this building. And I tried to get an architect to design it, but I couldn't find one that satisfied me. So I meditated, and this idea came to me, and that's what we have now for Pabbo Publications Building, which we now call the Hansa Temple, but at that time it was our printing business and central office. And again, Seva was the one responsible for getting that office started. She came to work every day at 9. Other people were off to the river or sleeping in, or there was no discipline at all. But seeing that example, she never said, you must do this, but seeing her come regularly, they began to realize, well, this is the way we ought to do it. And so more and more people began following her lead, and we began to develop a regular office. Well, before that, however, I announced that I was going to put that building up on the hill. Well, this created another huge uproar in the community. They wanted to decide, they didn't want a building there, and they wanted to tell me that I shouldn't do anything without all their approval. And finally I called a meeting together. I said, I am tired of this 1 horsepower energy. It's taken you 5 years just to get this dog out of here. You've already said that we can build an industrial, whatever businesses we have up there. You're the ones who told me where that could be. Now you're saying I can't do it. I said, listen, I didn't start this community for myself. I started it for you. And if you want it, I'm willing to work with it. But if you want to just keep on with 1 horsepower energy, I won't work that way. I can't work that way. You will have to agree that if I don't impose my will, but if I speak strongly about something, then I say, that's the time I feel guided from within, and you have to agree with me or I'm just not interested. And so we lost pretty close to half our people with that one thing. There was another thing that happened then, because the people at the farm were all up in arms against the things that I wasn't doing right. I wasn't bringing children in, I wasn't helping them more, and so on. And I called a meeting before they could call me on the carpet the way they had planned to. And I said, these are the things that we all need. These are problems we're facing. We aren't giving enough energy to the children. I named all these things and sort of took the wind out of their sails. Well, you have to do things sometimes in this way. You can't go through life as a fool. And also, I would have waited if necessary, because I would not have put this much energy into it and then just throw it all like leaves to the wind. But I knew that by this time, most people wanted to follow Master. Most people wanted to follow this path. Most people wanted to work in harmony and not to always be fighting and arguing and so on. So I knew that I'd have most people on my side in this. And so I said, now is the time that we need to come to a decision. I can leave tomorrow and never look back. It won't matter to me. I didn't do this for me. But if you want me, then you have to accept that it's got to be one person's vision. It can't be everybody's vision. And I do not impose my vision on you. I try to interest you in that vision. So I'm not going to bully you. But for you to bully me is for me not acceptable. And so, as I say, we lost quite a few people. Nearly half of the community left at that time. And it was one of those things you have to go through. But see how many struggles we've had over the years with opposition to what is basically a good thing. But not everybody's definition of a good thing can be the same, and we had to gradually bring Ananda to a point of self-definition. I always said, once we have self-definition, it'll be much easier, because then it'll be easy to say this is who we are, and that is not who we are. So new people who come don't start from the beginning in that self-definition. They all just either follow Ananda as it is or go off and start their own And in fact, some people tried to. None of them ever succeeded. Somebody said to me recently, well, it was easy for you to start a community, but it's very difficult now. No, it was not particularly easy, but it was a joy. Would I do it again? Yes, I would. Knowing all the problems we had to face? Yes, I would. Not at my age. I wouldn't do it again, knowing how little time I have, relatively speaking, in this incarnation, nor probably would I do it in any other. But putting myself back then, had I known what I would have to go through, yes, I would go through it. Doesn't mean a thing. If you can serve God, if you can have the joy of living for God and the joy of sharing that God with others, what greater joy can there be in this world? Because Ananda has been built on two basic principles. One of them is that people are more important than things, and the other is that where there is adherence to truth, there is victory. Nor do I consider what has happened to us lately a defeat, because we have stood by what we believe, we have stood by what we know to be true. You can't lose. If you won't be shaken in yourself, Master often used the expression that we should be so centered within that we can stand unshaken amidst the crash of breaking worlds. To be unshaken within means to lose everything and still be strong in yourself. God is our stocks and bonds, as Master said many years ago. God is our strength. And what it has taken to build Ananda will continue, because now you all know what you are doing. I'm not busy working on it anymore. I've done my bit, now it's yours. But I know that that spirit that Master instilled in me and through me in all of you will continue and will build a new way of life that will help the whole world. I think in 100 years or so, when people look back on this time, that they will say that one of the most important things happening on this planet was what we are doing at Ananda today. It will change the world, not quickly, not even in a century perhaps, but it's a new way of life. It's a Dwapara Yuga way of life, and it will make a new and better world, or let's say it will be instrumental in creating a new and better world. What better thing is there to live for than that? God bless you.